the Kilimanjaro.
African Renaissance paradigm. The objective is to trace the true geography of early civilization, mapping its path from the interior of East Africa, the up-south Nile origins, to its foundational influence on Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. The three lenses of historical analysis. Modern intellectuals must navigate three distinct methods of analyzing early human civilization. The program categorizes these historical methodologies. 1 is the Western mythological and religious frame. Second, the Western Civ Standard Academic Model. 3 African Renaissance study of African high culture. From the mythological and religious lens, the narrative and the framework relies on legend, mystery, and sacred texts to authenticate royal bloodlines and state power over millennia. The lineage, built on the post-flood biblical worldview, divides humanity among Noah's 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Kemetic/Hamitic, ancestors of Kush, ancient Ethiopia and Egypt, historically recognized as dark-skinned people of the African phenotype. Semite, Shem, frameworked as a mixed lineage, part African, part European Asiatic. Japhetic, traced to the Eurasian steppes, frameworked as the white race. This approach is usually Bible-based and establishes the origin of civilizations in Western Asia. It places Nimrod, the mighty warrior as a son of Cush, as the foundational builder of Mesopotamian civilization. It establishes Abraham as the common ancestor for the 3 major Western religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Often there is debate over whether the Garden of Eden was in Iraq, Mesopotamia, or in Africa, Ethiopia. The perspective of Western mythology is that it all began in Mesopotamia. The Western civilization lens. The academic status quo. The academic framework. The standard academic curriculum was designed in the 19th century. It is rooted in Platonism, Hegelian Eurocentrism, and social Darwinism. Intentionally, it separates the Nile Valley from Africa by classifying ancient Egypt and Ethiopia as Middle Eastern or Asiatic. The position here often claims that agriculture, domestication of animals, high science and intellect began exclusively in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, 10,000 years ago, dismissing or simply neglecting the developments in the African interior entirely. Ironically, the foundation for this angle of attack also has mythological foundations. It is based on Homer's accounts of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The African Renaissance lens. The scientifically updated view, the framework, pioneered by Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop and validated by modern archaeology, carbon dating, primary African records, and genetic science. This paradigm establishes that Nile Valley high culture developed independently, predating and inspiring Mesopotamia and Greece. It positions interior Africa as the true precursor to global civilization. It suggests that man had already reached a high point of cognitive development, mastering science and calculus before migration from the African continent. Therefore, he brought and taught these ideals wherever she or he traversed. The intellectual evolution, from Negritude to Renaissance. The struggle for self-determined African scholarship shifted dramatically during the mid-20th century. The Negritude movement began in the 1960s. Its key pioneer, Léopold Sédar Senghor, was from Senegal. The movement was spearheaded by intellectuals who were educated inside the European colonial capitals of Paris and London. Often they lacked access to updated African archaeological data, internalized many Eurocentric limitations. For example, Negritude conceded to the Hegelian trap, and its worldview, which is as follows: reason is Greek, emotion is Negro. At the time, our leaders generally did not have historical knowledge of the continent's great ancient civilizations. The African Renaissance movement from the 1970s to the present. Its key pioneer, Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, Senegal, was armed with physics and carbon-14 dating techniques. Diop shattered the 19th century myths. He proved that logic, architectural science, and philosophy were born in the Nile Valley. By the mid-1970s, following the Cairo Symposium, global bodies like UNESCO formally changed their stances, publishing the General History of Africa, which supported the African Renaissance position. Reversing the map, up south, modern maps place Europe on top, thus creating a modern psychological bias. To the ancient Kushites, the south was up because the Nile River flows northward for over 4,000 miles from the lakes of Uganda and Tanzania to the Mediterranean delta. Civilization traveled downstream, meaning it was birthed and highly developed in the southern interior before it reached its technical apex in Egypt. The Ancient Kushite Footprint in Wonderful Ethiopians of the Kushite Empire, 1934, Drusilla Dungy Houston reveals that ancient Ethiopia is among the oldest sovereign domains on Earth. Around 5000 BC, the civilization spanning both sides of the Red Sea fractured, dividing the Nile Valley from the Mesopotamian colony. This split left behind two variant scripts that was derived from the same people, Egyptian hieroglyphs and Babylonian cuneiform. The systematic discrediting of African people followed a distinct historical timeline after foreign invasions disrupted the Nile Delta and Mesopotamia. Cultural assimilation, invaders from Western Asia and Europe conquered the core African centers and adopted their advanced philosophy, mathematics, and architectural styles. Pre-colonial African values are essentially based on nature, balance, truth, and reciprocity. The concepts were rebranded by the conquerors. While embracing higher truths for themselves, they threatened the people to stay away from such ideas, eventually deeming the idea of and honoring the African ancestors who created the maths, the sciences, and had built irrigation as pagan and demonic. The replacement culture, the amateur systems of the conquerors institutionalized chaos, deception, selfishness, and systemic theft as the new global foundation. Classroom discussion. 1. On geography, why is the term up south vital to dismantling Eurocentric maps of the Nile Valley? 2. On assimilation, how did ancient invaders turn indigenous African concepts of cosmic balance and labeled them simply as pagan or demonic? 3. On science versus status quo, why do standard university Western Civ courses continue to teach 19th century historical models despite modern carbon dating and genetic updates? The Aksumite transition and the global Kushite realm, the pivot from ancient antiquity to Byzantine Christendom in the 4th century CE. The history of ancient Ethiopia is told historically from its Nile River civilizations and mythologically from sources across the Red Sea. From the historical view, the oldest document is the Narmer's Palet, while the mythological accounts often began with Abraham and the Ur of the Chaldeans. This module takes into account both narratives and traces the geopolitics of East Africa during the 4th century CE. It details how the Kingdom of Aksum embraced Orthodox Christianity, inherited Rome's imperial rivalries, and collided with the ancient, unyielding Kushite stronghold of Meroe. The Periplus of the Eritrean Sea was written by an unknown author. It gives an account of Ethiopia prior to the Greco-Roman era. It details how the Greek and later the Romans gained control over the Red Sea port of Adulis. The history of the world has been and is being updated. The first historical document comes from the Nile River. The story of Ethiopia is synonymous with the story of Kush as it extends into ancient Egypt and across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. It can be simplified into its prehistoric age, its 4 golden ages, and the 3 intermediate periods in between the golden ages. Prehistory marks the time before King Narmer Mens and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper being the lower parts in Kush and modern-day Sudan. Lower is the delta region near the Mediterranean Sea and the Levant. There are queens and kings before Narmer, however he is the first for whom archaeologists had formulated a story based on actual documents. The first king of Kush Ethiopia, Narmer Mens, ushered in the first golden age. His palette is dated to 3200 BC. The Old Kingdom lasted from 2686 to 2181 BCE. Dynasty 1 to 6 marks the age of pyramid building and the introduction of alphabetic writing in full sentences. The pre-dynastic age was pictographic. Therefore, from 3200 BC to 2100 BC, there was relative peace for more than 1000 years. The system broke down after King Pepi's reign. This breakdown was not caused by conquest, but by a cohesion of foreign and local alliances. This caused the first intermediate period. An intermediate period is a time where central authority in the system has broken. A dynasty is a family rule, or in some cases continuity in the founder's vision. Therefore, the 7th to the 11th dynasty ruled almost simultaneously. Central authority broke down and petty kings ruled in the north. The north, technically in the Kushite view, is the south. I had explained that this was so because of the way the Nile River flowed. During the intermediate periods, the arts, sciences, and philosophy became stagnant. The Classical Age, by the 12th dynasty order, was established again by another Kushite king named Mentuhotep. His name means warrior for peace. He had to go to war in order to restore peace. The Middle Kingdom and Second Golden Age lasted from around 2030 to 1650 BCE. The Second Intermediate Period lasted from 1650 BC to around 1500 BC. For 150 years the Hyksos ruled in the Delta. This is closer to the Mediterranean and the Levant. Down north. The Third Golden Age was initiated by a Kushite family in succession. After generations of continuous efforts and war, the natives were able to evict the Hyksos and establish order Mot again. Ahmoses and Kamoses established the 18th dynasty. Many famous historical figures like Hatshepsut, Queen Tai, Tutmosis, Ankheten and King Tut reigned around this time. The 19th dynasty also yielded many colossal structures and a renaissance in literature. Ramses II is the most famous in this dynasty. There are around 9 Rameses in the 19th dynasty. Ramesses 1–9. On the Menpata stele, who is Ramesses III, it mentions the settling of the Palestinians in Gaza, and on the same document it mentions Israel for the first time. The Third Golden Age, or the New Kingdom, lasted from around 1550 to 1077 BCE. The Third Intermediate Period came when kings from the west called Lydian kings gained power in the Delta after being assimilated in the army. They formed the 22nd to the 24th dynasty in the Delta region. However, again the Kushite had kept control and maintained order in the south, which is referenced as Upper Kemet. South is actually north in the Kushite worldview. Again, upper is lower and lower is upper. This is based on the flow of the Nile River. The most famous restoration and example of African Renaissance and greatness is the 25th Nubian Kushite dynasty. This is the Fourth Golden Age. Here Western scholars admit that these were black kings from the Kush. Even though Narmer's image has been preserved and is clearly African, Mentuhotep seems the blackest of them all. King Tut's images that were crafted by the sculptors who lived during his lifetime are still on tour or in the Cairo Museum and are visibly African. The admission of the black pharaohs represents a crack in the seal. The idea of African kings ruling independently. Western academics had claimed that all great African empires to be the work of either Asiatics or aliens. In around 790 BCE, Kushite King Kashta advanced a program to take back the North Delta region from the Asiatics and the Libyan kings. The plan was advanced by King Pi and under 25th dynasty kings Shabaka and Taharqa. The land was again in Kushite indigenous rule. One notable relic associated with Shabaka is the Shabaka stone. By the time he found it, the people had lost knowledge of what it was and were using it to grind millet. It was thousands of years old. It came from the age of the Great Pyramids. It had on it an African creation story. He found it and made it anew. King Taharqa was forced to retreat after the third battle against the Assyrians. Under King Ashurbanipal, the Levant and northern Egypt was seized in 631 BC. Ashurbanipal conquered Egypt, but Taharqa maintained Nubia and the Kushite realms in southern parts of Arabia called the Kingdom of Saba. His queendom still stretched from the foothills of the Nile, near Tanzania, and was at the time one of the largest in the world. His statues are museum favorites. After the retreat there were ups and downs in Kemet, ancient Egypt. After Taharqa in around 671 BC, the situation never amounted to a full restoration of indigenous rule in the north. Instead, power was concentrated in the south in Upper Kemet and in Kush. In 525 BCE the Persians invaded Egypt but failed to invade Kush. They suffered massive losses in attempting to penetrate into Kush. They had replaced the Assyrians, who were on the backs of the ancient Egyptians. However, they showed favor to the captives Judah and returned them from Babylon to the Levant, and also placed them on Elephant Island to hold a garrison position at the border of Kush. In 325 BC, Alexander the Macedonian Greek invades and conquers the Levant, Egypt, parts of India, and also rips into Persia itself. The Greeks at this time replaced the Persians, who were then on the backs of the Africans. Eventually, the Ptolemaic rulers after Alexander incorporated all the knowledge and wealth from their conquered regions and concentrated it in Alexandria, Egypt. The 1st century BCE is a notable mark in history and also in the realm of mythology. The Christian narrative begins when the Romans take charge in this region and continue the works to translate the wisdom of the realm that they had conquered. At this time, Coptic was the main language written and spoken in Egypt by the Greeks. Much of the ancient Egyptian language was carried over and written in Coptic. Amharic was the main language spoken by the Hebrews in the Levant. It appears that at some stage the stories of captivity in Babylon and the history of the Jewish people were documented and presented at the Library of Alexandria. The library was later burned and destroyed. However, many manuscripts survived because copies were scribed in more than one language. Still, a great part of human history was lost. Meroitic was the language in Kush. The Kushites created this language and writing system around 800 BC in order to better preserve their culture. This was during a time when the Delta was being overrun by foreign ideas. Unfortunately, much of this language was buried under Lake Nasser upon the opening of the Aswan Dam in 1970. This language would have revealed the Ethiopian accounts of its history. Instead, much of it was preserved in the hieroglyphic language. While mythological accounts might include Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. The sources for historical accounts in the 1st century range from Pliny the Elder and the Younger, Flavius Josephus, Tacitus and Strabo. Pliny the Elder was a writer and historian in the 1st century and a prefect of Rome. His nephew the Younger Pliny was a lawyer who wrote to the Roman emperor stating that he did not know how to respond to the Christians because he was not sure what laws they had broken. Josephus wrote in Aramaic. He was a Jewish general who was captured by the Romans and turned around and worked for the Romans instead. When Tacitus wrote in Latin, he made a reference to Christ, but not specifically Jesus. Strabo, who wrote in Greek, was a well-established author and geographer in his time, which is closer to the 2nd century of the Common Era. While mystical accounts can be referenced in the King James Version of the Bible and the apocryphal versions like the Book of Maccabees. The Book of Maccabees detail the Jewish revolts against the Greeks and Romans at the time starting in the 2nd century BC. Based on the accounts, this was in order to preserve their culture, history and identity amid the changes in empire and philosophy. We mentioned another 1st century reference is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, and that around this time merchants had established the port of Adulis along the Red Sea in modern-day Eritrea. Most interesting is a story detailed by Strabo. It mentions in Book 17 the Candic Queens of Kush. In 24 BCE, Queen Amanirenas defeated Roman forces and signed a treaty with Augustus Caesar, who was almost undefeated in battle at the time, securing her borders and a trade with the Mediterranean and that part of the world. By the 2nd century, Axum became a powerful trading center. In the 4th century, King Ezana converts to Christianity. The first major victory for Axum was its conquest over Meroe, scattering the Kushites with their powerful city-building techniques and metallurgy to the west, where they strengthened or formed the Ghanaian Empire. South, where they formed Manumatapa or Great Zimbabwe. The Christianization of Ethiopia, 4th century CE. The modern Ethiopian identity is a complex blend of its ancient, pre-Christian indigenous past and its 4th century adaptation to the Christian faith, making it one of the earliest Christian nations on earth. The conversion of King Ezana. 2 Greek-speaking Christian brothers from Syria were captured at sea and brought into the Aksumite royal court. One brother, Frumentius, was appointed as a tutor to the young Prince Ezana. Frumentius was successful in converting the young king and his immediate court to Christianity. Then he later traveled to Alexandria, Egypt, where he was formally consecrated. He returned to Ethiopia as the very first Abuna, high priest archbishop, cementing the alliance between Axum and Eastern Byzantine Christendom. Axum's proximity to the Red Sea allowed it to dominate trade with southern Arabia, Persia, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which generated immense wealth for its rulers. Ethiopia would enter Christendom on the side of the Eastern Coptic Orthodox tradition. The geopolitical enemies of the Byzantine Roman sphere automatically became the strategic rivals of Axum. While Axum grew wealthy along the Red Sea, a much older independent African power center had existed for centuries further inland along the Nile, Meroe, modern-day Sudan. After retreating from Egypt, the Kushites relocated their capital from Napata further up south, up the river to Meroe. The dangerous, rocky cataracts of the Nile River acted as natural military barriers. Still, they completely prevented Roman warships from sailing into the interior of Kush. The global Kushite diaspora, the ancient map, according to the historical reconstructions of Drusilla Dungy Houston and ancient writers like Herodotus, 5th century BCE, the ancient Kushite realm originally cast a massive cultural and geopolitical shadow. The ancient Kushite realm stretched from the Levant into Western Asia, to Europe and in the Americas, southern Arabia, Yemen, populated the Sabians, who were directly under the cultural governance of the Kushite realm. During the 25th dynasty under kings Shabaka and Taharqa, c. 750 BCE, these regions were actively administered from the African mainland. The Levant, modern-day Palestine and Israel were anchored by Kushite influence at least from 1550 BC, when Tutmosis of the 18th dynasty in ancient Egypt reconquered it. Within this period there were ups and downs in terms of African control and its grip on this region. After King Taharqa was forced to retreat around 650 BCE due to the invading Assyrians, the region came under control of the foreigners. Herodotus documented that the Ethiopians held domain over two distinct geographic regions, one in Africa and one in India. The Dravidians were the builders of the Indus Valley civilization in India. In early Europe, the Etruscans introduced core elements of high culture, metallurgy, and early writing systems to Crete and early Greece. Following deep structural collapses, Europe lost the art of writing, only reclaiming literacy around the 6th century BCE. In the Americas, the colossal Olmec stone heads of Mesoamerica, dating to 1500 BCE, feature unmistakable African phenotypes. These massive monuments provide undeniable material evidence that Africans were highly revered, structurally organized, and active in the Americas thousands of years before Columbus. East Asia, early Chinese civilization under the Shang dynasty maintained a clear African cultural similarity. The 1974 archaeological unearthing of China's terracotta army revealed elaborate, ancient burial styles that directly mirror traditional African spiritual and ancestral practices. Classroom discussion prompts: 1 on strategic shifts. How did Aksum's adoption of Christianity change its relationship with the older Kushite capital of Meroe? 2 on warfare. What military and geographical advantages allowed ancient Kush to remain independent from Persian and Roman conquerors for thousands of years? On material evidence, how do the Olmec stone heads, 1500 BCE, and the terracotta army discoveries, 1974, challenge the standard Western civ narrative of world history?
From the Kilimanjaro, Ethiopia, the Kanesh, not Lucy, the Great Rift Valley, across the Red Sea, Nile River, Congo, Niger, Zambezi, Ile, Western Sudan, Mali, Songhai, Ilelelele.